Welcome to the campfire. It's always fun to be here. Like telling stories, like seeing you people, like knowing that you're hanging around with us and enjoying these same things we are. And tonight, we've got some more from The Seventh Man by Max Brand. This is the book 3 of the Untamed series. We're starting at chapter 22. So if you get yourself comfortable, get yourself something to drink, get a little something to nibble on maybe, and get settled in. And, well, here's chapter 22, The Fifth Man. The very moment that Vic Gregg stood in the open air, with the last appeal of Betty ringing still at his ear, he felt a profound conviction that he was about to die. And he stood a moment, breathing deeply, taking the faint alkali scent of the dust and looking up to the stars. It was that moment when night blends with day. There's no sign of light in the sky except the stars burn more and more bright as the darkness thickens. And Vic Gregg watched the stars draw down more closely and believed that he was seeing this for the last time. Alder seemed inexpressibly dear to him as he stood there through a little space, and vaguely discernible outlines of the shacks along the street were like the faces of friends. In that house behind him was Betty Neal, waiting, praying for him. And indeed, had it not been for shame, he would have weakened now and turned back, for he hardly knew which way to turn. He wanted to save Ronicky and the other two from the attack of Barry, yet he would not lay a trap for Dan. To Barry he owed a vast debt. His debt to the three was that which any human owes to any other. He was to save them from the wolf which ran through the night in the body of a man. That thought sent him at a run for Captain Lorimer's saloon. It was lighted brightly by the gasoline lamps within, but a short distance away from it he heard no sound. His imagination drew a terrible picture of the big empty room with 3 dead men laying in the center of it, where the destroyer had reached them one by one. That was what took the blood from his face and made him a white mask of tragedy when he stepped into the door of the saloon. It was quiet, but a half a dozen men sat at the tables in the corner, and among them were Ronicky and the other two. Silver Waldron was in the very act of pulling back his chair. And perhaps all 3 had just come in. Perhaps Barry had come here to look for his quarry and found them not yet arrived. Perhaps he was now hunting in other places through the town. Perhaps he was even now crouched in the shadow near at hand and ready to attack. It made the hand of Vic Gregg contract with a cruel pressure when it fell on the shoulder of Silver Waldron. "Now what in hell?" grunted the hardened warrior. He had no love for Vic Gregg since that day when the posse rode through the hills after him. Neither had Ronicky or Gus Reeve, who rose from their chairs as if at a signal. "Come with me, gents," said Vic, "and come quick." They asked no questions and did not stay to argue the point, for he had that in his face which meant action. He led them outside and behind the horse shed of the saloon. "We're alone?" he asked. "Nothing in sight. Look sharp." They peered about them through the night, and a wan moon only helped to make the darkness visible. "Gents, we may be alone now, but we ain't going to be alone long. Get your hosses and ride like hell. Barry is in town. Vic, you're drunk. I tell you, he's been seen." "Then by God," growled Silver Waldron, "lead me to him. I need to have a little talk with that gent." "Lead you to him," echoed Vic Gregg. "Silver, are you hungering to push daisies?" "Look here, bud," answered the older man, and he laid a hand on the shoulder of Vic. "You been with this Barry gent, and you lived in his house. Do you mean to say you're one of the lot that talks about him like he was a ghost that bullets just couldn't harm? I tell you, son, there's been so much chatter about him that folks forget he's human. I'm going to remind him of that little fact." Vic Gregg groaned. Even while he talked, he was glancing over his shoulder as if he feared the shadows under the moon. His voice was half gasp and half whisper. "Silver, Ronicky, don't ask me how I know. Just believe me when I say Dan Barry'll never die by the hand of any man. I tell you, he can see in the dark." A soft oath from Gus Reeve, a twitch in Ronickey's head, told him that this last had taken effect. Silver Waldron suddenly altered his manner. "All right, Vic. Trot back into town or come with us. We're going to move out." "The wisest thing you ever done, Sliver." "I'm feeling the same way," breathed Gus Reeve. "So long," whispered Vic Gregg and faded into the night. Running. The others, without a word among themselves, gathered their horses and struck down the valley out of Alder. The patting and swish of the sand about their feet of their mounts, the very creaking of the saddle leather seemed to alarm them. They were continually turning and looking back. That is, Gus Reeve and Ronicky Joe manifested these signs of trouble, but Sliver Waldron, riding in the center of the trio, never moved his head. They were hardly well out of town when a swift rush of hoofbeats swept up from behind, and a horseman darted into the pale mist of the valley, bending low over his pommel to cut the wind of his riding. "Who is it?" "Vic Gregg," muttered Gus Reeve. "Stir along, Sliver. Vic ain't lingering any." But Sliver Waldron drew rein and let his horse go on at a walk. "Hearing you talk, Ronicky," he said, "you'd better think you was really scared of Dan Barry." Ronicky Joe stiffened in his saddle, peered through the uncertain light to make out if Sliver was jesting. But the latter seemed perfectly grave. "A gent would almost think," went on Sliver, "that we three was running away from Barry, instead of going out to set a trap for him." There was something nearly akin to a grunt from Gus Reeves, but Ronicky merely continued to stare at the leader. "'S a matter of fact," said Sliver, "when Vic was talking, I sort of felt the chills go up my back. How about you, Ronicky?" "I'll tell a man," sighed Ronicky. "While Vic was a-talking, I seen that devil coming on his hoss like he'd done when he broke out of that cabin that night. I'll tell you straight, Sliver, I had my gun drilled on him. I couldn't have missed. But after I fired, he kept straight on. It was like puncturing a shadow." "Sure," nodded Sliver. "Shooting by night ain't never a sure thing." Ronicky wiped his heated brow. "So I sent Vic away before he had a chance to get real nervous. But when he comes back, well, boys, it'll be kind of amusing to watch Vic's face when he saunters into town tomorrow and sees Dan Barry. Maybe dead, maybe in the irons, huh?" Only a deep silence answered him. But in the interest which his words excited, the terror seemed to have left Ronicky and Gus. They rode close, their heads towards Sliver alone. "There goes Vic," mused Sliver. "There he goes. Go on, Mac, you old fool. Scared to death, riding for his life. And why? 'Cause he believes some ghost stories he'd heard about Dan Barry." "Ghost stories?" echoed Reeves. "Some of them ain't fairy tales, Sliver." "Just name one that ain't." "Well, the way he trailed Jim Silent. We've all heard of Silent, and Barry was too good for him." "Bah," sneered Sliver. "Too good for Silent? You lied readily enough. Booze done for Silent long before Barry come along." "That right." "I'll tell a man it is. Mind you, I don't think Barry ain't handy with his gun, but he's done a little, and the gents have furnished the trimmings. Look here, if Barry is this man-eater they say, why did he pick a time for coming down when that sheriff was out of town?" "By God," exclaimed Ronicky. "Now, I never thought of that." "Sure you didn't," chuckled Sliver. "But this sucker figures that you and Gus and me will be easy pickings. He figures we'll do what Vic did, hit for the tall pines. Then he'll blow around how he ran the four of us out of Alder. Be pleasant coming back to talk like that, huh?" There was a volley of rapid curses from the other two. "Well, we'll get this cheapskate, Sliver," suggested Ronicky. "We'll get this ghost and tie him up and take him back to Alder and make a show of him." "We will," nodded Sliver. "Have you figured how?" "Lie out here in the bush. He'll hunt around Alder all night, and when the morning comes he'll leave and he'll come out this way. We'll be ready for him. whereas the valley narrows down there. They say his hoss and his dog is as bad as any two ordinary men. Well, that's three of them, and here's three of us. It's an even break, huh?" "Ronicky," murmured Sliver. "I always know you'd had the brains. We'll take this gent and tame him, and run him back to Alder at the end of a rope." Gus Reeve whooped and waved his hat at that thought. So the three reached the point where the shadowy walls of the valley narrowed down, drew almost together. And it was here that they placed their horses in a shallow hollow near that southern cliff. They returned to take post. There was only one bridle path which wound through the gulch here, and the three concealed themselves behind a thicket of sagebrush to wait it out. See, they laid their plan carefully. Each man was to have his particular duty. Gus Reeve, adept with the rope, would wait until that black stallion was cantering past, then toss his noose and throw the horse. At that same instant, Ronicky Joe would shoot the wolf dog, and Sliver Waldron would perforate Dan Barry, while the latter rolled in the dust. Unless, indeed, he was pinioned by the fall of his horse, in which case they would have the added glory of taking him back alive. And by the time all these details were settled and the pale moonlight was shot through at the rose of dawn, then rapidly the mountains lifted into view. Range beyond range, all their gullies deep blue and purple, and here and there sharp triangles of snow. There was not a cloud, not even a trace of mist, and through that crisp, thin air, the vision carried as if through a telescope. They could count the trees on the upper ridges, and that while the floor of the valley was still in shadow. This, in turn, grew brilliant, and everywhere the sagebrush glittered like foliage carved in gray-green quartz. It was then that they saw Dan Barry. Well, the dawn was still around him, and before the sun pushed up in the east above the mountains, he came winding down the bridle path with the dawn glittering on his side of Satan, and a dark, swift form spiriting on ahead. "Look at him," muttered Sliver Waldron. "The damned wolf is a scout. See him nose around that hummock? Watch him smell behind that bush. The black devil." Bart, in fact, wove a loose course before his master, running here and there to all points of vantage, as if he knew that danger lurked ahead. But where he came close, with only the narrow passage between the cliffs, he seemed to make up his animal brain that there could be no trouble in so constricted a place, and darted straight ahead. "They're ours," whispered Waldron. "Steady, boys. Gus, get your rope. Get ready." Gus tossed the noose a little wider and gathered himself for the throw. But it seemed as if the wolf saw or heard the movement. He stopped suddenly and stood with his head high. Behind him the rider checked the black horse, and all three waited. "He's trying to get the wind," chuckled Waldron, "but the wind is agin our faces." It was only a slight breeze, but it came directly against the lurking three, and moreover the scent of the sage was particularly keen this time of the day, and quite sufficient to blur the scent of a man even in the keen nostrils of Black Bart. Only for a second or so he stood there snuffing the wind. A huge animal, God, larger than any wolf the three of them had ever seen. His face wise in a certain bear-like fashion from the three gray marks in the center of his forehead. Now he trotted ahead, and the stallion broke into a gallop behind. "My God," whispered Sliver to Gus, "don't spoil that hoss when you daub the rope on him. Look at that action. It's like running water." They came more rapidly. As if the rider knew that a point of danger was there to be passed, he spoke to his mount, and Satan lengthened into a racing gait that blew the brim of the rider's hat straight up. On they came. The wolf dog darted past. Then as the horse swept by, Gus Reeve rose up from behind his bush, and the rope darted snake-like from his hand. The 4 feet of Satan landed in the noose, and the next instant that back-flung weight of Gus tightened the rope, and Satan shot over upon his side, flinging his master clear of the saddle. It sent him rolling over and over in the dust, and Sliver Waldron was on his feet with both guns in action, sending bullet after bullet towards the tumbling body. Gus Reeve was running towards the stallion, his rope in action to entangle one of the hind feet and make sure of his prey. Ronicky Joe had leapt up with a yell and blazed away at Black Bart. It was no easy mark to strike, for the moment that rope shot out from the hand of Gus, that wolf dog whirled in his tracks and darted straight for the scene of action. It was that, perhaps, which troubled the aim of Ronicky more than anything else, for wild animals do not whirl in this fashion and run for an assailant. He had expected to find himself plugging away at a flying target in the distance. Instead, that black monster was rushing straight for him, silently. Indeed, all that followed was in silence after that first wild Indian yell from Ronicky Joe. His gun barked, but Black Bart was running like a football player down a broken field, swerving here and there with uncanny speed. Again, Joe missed, and then flung up his arm towards the flying danger. But Black Bart shot from the ground to make his kill. He could bring down the strongest bull in the herd. What was the arm of a man to him? His snake-like head shot through that futile guard. His teeth cut off the screams of Ronicky Joe, and down they went. The gun flew from the hand of Ronicky. For an instant he struggled with hands and the writhing legs, and then the murderous teeth of Bart sank deeper, found the life. The dead body was limp. But Bart, shaking his hold deeper to make sure, glared across to his fallen master. The third man had died for Grey Molly. All this had happened in a second, and the body of Barry was still rolling when a gun flashed in his hand, drawn while he tumbled. It spat fire, and Sliver Waldron staggered forward drunkenly, waving both his armed hands as if he was trying to talk by signal, and pitched on his face into the dust. The fourth man had died for Grey Molly. No gun was destined for Gus Reeve, however. Black Bart had left the lifeless body of his victim and was darting towards the third man. The master was on his knee, raising his gun for the last shot. But Gus Reeve was blind to all that had happened. He saw only the black stallion, the matchless prize of horseflesh. He tossed a loop in the taut rope to entangle a bind foot, but that slackening of the line gave Satan his instant purchase, and a moment later he was on his feet, whirled, and the two iron-hard hooves crushed the whole framework of that man's chest just like an eggshell. The impact lifted him from his feet, but before that body struck the ground, the life had fled from it. The fifth man had died for Grey Molly. Chapter 23, Bad News. News of the killing at Alder, as they called that night's slaughter, to this day in that mountain desert, traveled swiftly and lost nothing of bulk and burden on the way, so that 2 days later, when Lee Haines went down for mail to the wretched little village in the valley, he heard the storekeeper retelling the story to an awe-stricken group. How that tale had crossed all the wild mountains which lay between in so brief a space no man could say. But first, there ran a whisper, then a stir, then a half-dozen men came in at once, each with an elaboration of the theme more horrible than the last. The storekeeper culled the choicest fragments from every version, strung them all together with a narrative of his own fertile invention, polished off the tale by a few rehearsals in his home, then placed his product on the open market. The very first day he kept the storeroom well filled from dawn till dark. And this was a creation to which Lee Haines had to listen, impatient, sifting the chaff from the grains of truth. Down upon Alder, exactly at midnight, had ridden a cavalcade headed by that notorious, half-legendary manslayer, Dan Barry, Whistlin Dan. And while his crew of 200 hardened ruffians held the doors and windows with leveled rifles, Barry had entered with a gun and a wolf, a wild wolf, and had butchered 10 men, wantonly. To add to the mystery, there was no motive of robbery for the crime. One sweeping visitation to death, then the night riders had rushed away. Nor was this all, for Sheriff Pete Glass, hearing of the tragedy, had ridden to Rickett, the county seat, and from this strategic point of vantage he was sending out a call for the most practiced fighters on the mountain desert. He wanted 20 men proved beyond the shadow of a question for courage, endurance, speed, and surety in action. And, concluded the storekeeper, fixing his eye upon Lee Haines, if you want a long ride free of charge, and $10 a day with chow thrown in, some of you gents ought to go to Rickett and chin with Pete. Haines waited to hear no more. He even forgot to ask for the Barry mail, swung into his saddle and rode with red spurs back to the cabin in the mountains. And there he drew Buck Daniels aside, and they walked among the rocks while Haines told the story. When it was ended, they sat on some adjoining boulders and chucked pebbles aimlessly into the emptiness beyond the cliff. "Mebbe," says Buck suddenly, "it wasn't Dan at all. He sure wouldn't be riding with no crowd of gents like that." "A fool like that storekeeper could make a crowd of Indians out of one papoose," answered Haines. "It was Dan. Who else would be traipsing around with a dog that looks like a wolf and hunts men?" "Well, I remember when Dan cornered Jim Silent in that cabin, and all of Jim's gang was with him, and Black Bart—" "Buck," cut in Haines, "you've remembered plenty." After a moment, "When are you going in to break the news to Kate?" Buck Daniels regarded him with an angry astonishment. "Me? I'd sooner cut my tongue out." He drew a great breath. "I feel like Dan was dead. The best thing for Kate if he were. That's a queer thing to say, Lee. The meat would be rotted off your bones 6 years ago in Elkhead if he hadn't been for Whistlin Dan. I know it, Buck, but I'll tell you straight that I could never feel towards Dan as if he was a human being, but a wolf in the hide of a man. He turned my blood cold. Always has." Buck Daniels groaned aloud as thoughts poured back on him. "Of all the pals that ever a man had," he said sadly, "there never was a partner like Whistlin Dan. There was never another gent that could go through hell for you just because you'd eaten meat with him. The first time I met him, I tried to double-cross him, because I had my orders from Silent. And Dan played clean with me. By God, he shook hands with me when he left." He straightened a little. So help me God, Lee, I've never done a crooked thing more since I shook hands with Dan that day." He sat silent, but breathing hard. "Well, this is the end of Whistlin Dan. The law will never let up on him now. But I tell you, Haines, I'm sick inside, and I'd give my right hand plumb to the wrist to set him straight and bring him back to Kate. Go in and tell her, Lee, I'll wait for you right here." "You'll be damned," cried Haines. "I've done my share by bringing the word this far. You can replay it." Buck Daniels produced a silver dollar. "Heads or tails?" "Heads," said Haines. The dollar spun upwards, winking, and clanked on the rocks. "Tails up." Haines stared at it with a grisly face. "Good God," he muttered. "What'll I do, Buck, if she faints?" "Faints?" echoed Daniels. "There's no fear of that. The first thing you'll have to do is to saddle her horse. Now what in the hell are you driving at? She'll be thinking of Joan. God knows she's worried enough because Dan hasn't brought that kid back before this, but when she hears what he's done now, she'll know that he's wild for keeps, and she'll be on the trail to bring that young'un home." He turned his back cleanly on the house and set his shoulders tense. "Go on now, Lee. Be a man." He heard the steps of Haines start briskly enough for the house, but they trailed away, slowly and more slowly, and finally there was a long pause. "He's standing at the door," muttered Buck. "Thank God I ain't in his boots." He jerked out his papers and his tobacco. In the very act of twisting that cigarette tight, the door slammed, and he ripped that flimsy thing in two. He started to take another paper, but his fingers were so unsteady that he could not pull away the single sheet of tissue which he wanted. Then his hands froze in place. A faint tapping came out to him. He's rapping on her door, whispered Buck. Remained fixed in place, his eyes staring straight before him. The seconds, they slipped away. He's turned yaller, murmured Buck. He couldn't do it. It'll be up to me. But he had hardly spoken the words when a low cry came out to him from the house. Then the silence again, and Buck Daniels began to mop his forehead. After that, once, twice, and again, he made the effort to turn towards the house, but when he finally succeeded, it was whole minutes later, and Lee Haines was leading a saddled horse from the corral. Kate stood beside the cabin awaiting. When he reached her, she'd already mounted. He halted beside her, panting, his hands on her bridle. "Don't do it, Kate," he pleaded. "Let me go with you. Let me go and try to help." The brisk wind up the gulch set her clothes a-fluttering, stirred the hair about the rim of her hat, and she seemed to Buck more gracefully, more beautifully young than she had ever been. But her face was like stone. "You'd be no help," she answered. "When I get to the place, I may have to meet him. Would you face him, Buck?" His hand fell away from the bridle. It was not so much what she said as that cold, steady voice with which she spoke that unnerved him. Then without a farewell, she turned the brown horse around and struck across that meadow at a swift gallop. Buck turned to meet that sick face of Haines. "Well," he said, "let me have that flask." Buck produced a metal life-saver, and Haines, with nervous hands, unscrewed the top and lifted it to his lips. He lowered it after a long moment and stood bracing himself against the wall. "It was hell, Buck. God help me if I ever have to go through a thing like that again." "I see what you done," said Buck angrily. "You walked right in and you took your story in both hands and you knocked her down with it. Haines, of all the ornery, thick-headed cayuses I ever seen, you're the most outbeatenest." "I couldn't help it." "Why not?" "When I went in, she took one look at me, then jumped up and stood as straight as a pine tree. 'Lee,' she said, 'what have you heard?' 'Why, about what?' I asked her, and I looked sort of indifferent. 'Dan,' snorted Buck, 'she could see death and hell written all over your face, most like.' 'I suppose,' muttered Haines. I was sick." "Tell me," she said, coming close up. "Well, he's gone wild again," was all I could put my tongue to. Then I blurted it out. I had to get rid of the damn story some way, and the quickest way seemed the best, how Dan rode into Alder and did the killing. When I got to that, she gave one cry. "I know," said Buck, shuddering, like something dying. Then she asked me to saddle her horse. Now, I begged her to let me go with her, and she said to me what she just said to you, and so I stayed. What good could we do against the devil? Chapter 24, The Music. To the last ravine, Kate's horse carried her easily enough. But that mountain pass was impenetrable through all its length to anything except the uncanny agility of Satan, and so she left that cowpunny in the bottom of the gorge and climbed the last rise on foot. On the mountainside above her, it was not easy to locate the cave, for the slope was clawed into ravines and confused with meaningless crisscross gulches. Whatever scrub evergreens grew there stood under the shade of boulders which threatened each instant to topple over and go thundering to the base. She'd come upon the cave by chance in her ride with Dan, and now she hunted vainly through the great stones for that entrance. A fresh wind, chill with the snows of the upper peaks, pulled and tugged at her and cut her hands and face, flying bits of sand. It kept up a whistling so insistent that it was some time before she recognized in the hum of the gale a different note. Not of unpleasant music, but a thin, shrill sound that blended with the voice of the wind. The instant she heard it, she stopped short on the lee side of a tall rock and looked about her in terror. The mountains walked away on every side, and those resolute masses gave her courage. She listened, for that big rock cut away the breath of the wind about her ears, and she could make out the whistling more clearly. It was a strain as delicate as a pinpoint ray of light in a dark room, but it made Kate tremble. Until the sound ended, she stayed there by a rock, hearkening. But the moment it ceased, she gathered her resolution, with a great effort, went straight toward the source of the whistling. It was only a moment away, although the wind had made it seem much further, and she came on the tall, narrow opening with Joan sitting on a rock just within. Instead of the blue coat, she was wrapped in a tawny hide. The yellow hair blew this way and that, unsheltered from the wind. The loneliness of this little figure made Kate's heart ache, made her pause on her way, and while she hesitated, Joan's head rested back against the rock, her eyes half closed, her lips pursed. She began to whistle that same keen, eerie music. It brought Kate to her in a rush. "Oh, Joan," she cried, "my baby!" And she would have swept that child into her arms. But Joan slipped out from under her very fingers and stood a little distance off, with her hands pressed against the wall on either side of her, ready to dart one way or the other. It was not sudden terror, but rather a resolute determination to struggle against capture to the end, and her blue eyes were blazing with excitement. Kate was on her knees with her arms held out. "Joan, dear, have you forgotten Munner?" The wilderness flickered away from the eyes of the child, little by little. "Munner?" she repeated dubiously. No shout of welcome, no sudden rush, no arms to fling about her mother. But if her throat was dry and closed, Kate allowed no sign of it to creep into her voice. "Where's Daddy Dan?" "He gone away." "Where?" "Oh, over there." The mother rose slowly to her feet, looked out across the mountains as if in search of aid. For her mind had harked back to that story her father used to tell of the coming of Dan Barry, how he had ridden across the hills one evening and saw, walking against the sunset, a tattered boy who whistled strangely as he went. And when old Joe Cumberland asked where he was going, he only waved a vague hand toward the north and answered, "Oh, over there." It was a sufficient destination for him. It was sufficient explanation now for the child. She remembered how she, herself a child then, had sat at her father's table and watched the brown face of that strange boy with fascination, and the wild, quick eyes which went everywhere and rested in no one place. There were the eyes which looked up to her now from Joan's face, and she felt suddenly divorced from her baby, as if all the blood in Joan were the blood of her father. "He left you here alone?" she murmured. The child looked at her with a sort of curious amazement. "Joan isn't alone." She whistled softly, and around the corner of the rock peered two tiny, beady, bright eyes in the sharp nose of a coyote puppy. It disappeared at once at the sight of the stranger, and now all the strength went from Kate. She slipped helplessly down and sat on a boulder trying to think, trying to master the panic which chilled her. For she thought of the day when Whistlin Dan brought home to the Cumberland ranch that wounded wolf dog, Black Bart. But the call of Joan had traveled far, and now a squirrel came in at a gallop, with his vast tail bobbing behind him, and he ran right up the rock until he was on the shoulder of the child. From the point of vantage, however, he saw Kate, was instantly on the floor of the cave and scurrying for the entrance, chattering with rage. The wild things came to Joan as they came to her father, and the eyes of the child were the eyes of Dan Barry. It came home to Kate, and she saw the truth for the first time in her life. She'd struggled to win him away from his former life, but now she knew that it was not just habit which controlled him, for he was wild by instinct, by nature, just as the tang of his untamed blood had turned the child to this, and a few more days of life with him would leave her wild forever. "He left you alone here?" she repeated fiercely. where 1,000 things might happen? Thank God I found you." Even if her words conveyed little meaning to Joan, the intonation carried a message which was perfectly clear. "Don't you like Daddy Dan?" Joan, I love him, of course." But Joan sat with a dubious eye which quickly darkened into fear. "Oh, Munner, don't take us back." Such horror and terror and sadness mixed. The tears pushed into the eyes of Kate. "Do you want to stay here, sweetheart?" "Yes, Munner." "Without me?" At first Joan shook her head decidedly, but thereafter she quickly became thoughtful. "No, except when we eat." "You don't want me here at dinner time? Poor Munner will get so hungry." A great concession was about to burst from the remorseful lips of Joan, but again second thoughts sobered her. She remained in a quandary, unable to speak. "Don't you want me even when you wake up at night?" "Why? Because you're afraid of the dark?" "Oh, Joan's not afraid. Oh, no, Joan loves the dark." If Kate maintained a smile, it was a frozen grimace. It had only been a few days, hardly yesterday that Joan left, and already she was just a little stranger. Suppose Dan had refused to come back himself, refused even to come and give up Joan. She started up, clutching the hand of the child. "Quick, Joan, we must go." "No, Joan doesn't want to go." "Well, we'll go for a little walk. We'll surprise Daddy Dan." "But Daddy Dan won't come back for a long, long time, not till the sun is away down below that hill." That should mean 2 hours at least, thought Kate. She could wait a little. "Joan, what taught you not to be afraid of the dark?" This problem made Joan look about for an answer, but at length she called softly, "Jackie." She waited and then whistled, and then at once the bright eyes of the little coyote appeared around the edge of the rock. "Come here," she commanded. He slunk out with his head turned towards Kate and all cowered at the feet of the child. The mother cringed inwardly at the sight. All wild things which hated man instinctively with tooth and claw were the friends, the allies of Whistlin Dan, and now Joan was stepping in her father's path. A little while longer and the last vestige of gentleness would pass from her. She would be like Dan Barry, following calls which no other human could even hear. It meant one thing. At whatever cost, Joan must be taken from Dan and kept away. "Jackie sleeps near me," Joan was saying. "We can see in the dark, can't we, Jackie?" She lifted her head, and the moment her compelling eyes left him, Jackie scooted for shelter. The first strangeness had worn away from Joan, and she began to chatter away about life in the cave, and how Satan played there by the firelight with Black Bart, and how sometimes, wonderful sight, Daddy Dan played with them. The recital was quite endless. As they pushed farther and farther into the shadows, and it was the uneasiness which the dim light raised in her that made Kate determine that the time had come to go home. "Now," she said, "we're going for that walk." "Not away down there," cried Joan. Kate winced. "It's a lot nicer here, Munner. You ought to see what we have to eat, and my Daddy Dan knows how to fix things." "Of course he does. Now put on your hat and your cloak, Joan. This is a lot warmer, Munner." "Don't you like it?" she added in alarm, stroking the delicate fur. "Take it off." Kate ripped away the fastening and tossed that skin far away. "Oh," breathed Joan. "It isn't clean. It isn't clean," cried Kate. "Oh, my poor darling baby. Get your bonnet and your cloak, Joan, quickly." "We're coming back?" "Of course." Joan trudged obediently to the side of the cave and produced both articles, sadly rumpled, and Kate buttoned her onto them, and trembling fingers, something akin to cold, made her shake now. It was very much like a child's fear of the dark. But as she turned towards the entrance of the cave and caught the hand of Joan, the child wrenched herself free. "We'll never come back," she wailed. "Munner, I won't go. Joan, you come to me this instant." Grief and fear and defiance had set that child trembling, but what the mother saw was the glint of the eyes, uneasy, hunting escape with animal cunning. It turned her heart cold, and she knew, with a sad, full knowledge, that Dan was lost forever, and that only one power could save Joan, and that power was herself. "I won't go. Joan!" A resolute silence answered her, and when she went threateningly forward, Joan shrank into the shadows near the rock. It was the play of light striking slantwise from the entrance, no doubt, but it seemed to Kate that a flicker of yellow light danced across the eyes of the child. And it stopped Kate, took her breath with the new terror. Dan Barry in the old days had lived a life as quiet as a summer's day. Until that time, Jen's silence struck him down in the saloon, and she remembered how Black Bart had come for her and led her to the saloon, and how she found Dan lying on the floor streaked with blood, very pale, and how she had kneeled by him in a panic, and how his eyes had opened and stared at her without answer, and the yellow, inhuman light swirled in them until she rose and backed out the door and fled in a hysteria of fear up the road. Now that had been the beginning of the end for Dan Barry. That instant when his eyes changed. And now Joan. She ran at her swiftly and gathered her into her arms. One instant of wild struggling, and then that child lay still. Her head straightened a little. A shrill whistle pealed through the cave. Kate stopped that piercing call with her hand, but when she turned, she saw in the entrance that dark body of Bart and his narrow snake-like head. Well, there you go, folks. Just another couple chapters, and it was really good to have you all around and share stories with you. And I can't wait for the next time. Until then, of course, be careful out there, folks. It's kind of strange times. Be good to your neighbors and your family, and I'll talk to you soon. This is Clay Steele.